The snow came down like handfuls of flour tossed from heaven, burying the ridgeline and muffling every sound on the Montana plateau. It was the kind of cold that froze lashes together and snapped timber like brittle glass. Martha Green hadn't spoken to another soul in months, not since the last delivery wagon had passed in autumn. 6 winters had come and gone since her husband died in the war, and diphtheria took her daughter in the same cruel season. After that, Martha stopped letting the world in. Her cabin, hand-built from thick logs and lined with wool and silence, stood hunched against the wind, like a woman bracing for sorrow. The hearth hissed with a slow, reluctant fire. Outside, the wind howled like a coyote denied a kill. Inside, Martha stirred the ashes and added a stick of seasoned pine. She moved with the rhythm of necessity, measured, practiced, quiet. She had no use for words, not anymore. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud, just 3 quick raps, but it cut through the wind like a blade. Martha froze mid-motion, a wooden spoon in one hand, and her breath caught in her chest. The knock came again, firmer this time. She didn't hurry. There were few things left that could frighten her. With a calm forged in years of solitude, she grabbed the lantern from its hook, its light a trembling gold. Through the frosted pane, she saw a shape. A man, stooped with exhaustion, stood clutching something bundled in a blanket. His shoulders sagged under weight more than snow. When she opened the door, the storm rushed in like a scolded ghost. "My horse died 5 miles back," the man said, voice gravel and desperation. "We walked. My boy's freezing. Please, just one night." Martha didn't answer right away. She looked down at the child, small, wrapped in worn wool, his breath, shallow cheeks flushed with too much cold or not enough warmth. The man's arms were trembling, not just from the temperature. "My stove's small," she said flatly, "and the floor's colder than outside." The man nodded once, already expecting rejection. "We got nowhere else." He didn't beg. He didn't cry. He just stood there like a man who'd lost everything but one last thread, and even that was unraveling. Martha studied his coat, good leather collar frayed. His hands were rough, cracked with work, and held the boy like he'd once held something fragile and failed to keep it. That she understood. She stepped aside. "Come in." He passed through the door like a breath collapsing. The boy in his arms let out a soft, involuntary whimper. The fire reached toward them, lapping at the cold. Martha shut the door hard, locking the storm back outside. She didn't speak. She didn't ask his name. She simply added more wood to the fire and ladled water into a small iron pot. The cabin, long kept for one, now held 3. The man, Jacob, though she would not learn his name until much later, laid the boy near the hearth and unwrapped the outer layers with hands still shaking. The child, stirred lips chapped and pale. Martha didn't move closer, but she watched. The boy's limbs were thin, his breath too light. "Henry," the man whispered, "come on now." Still, no questions came from Martha's lips. No words of comfort either. She pulled another log from the pile and shoved it into the fire with a bit more force than necessary. The flames responded with a greedy roar. Jacob removed the boy's damp clothes and began rubbing warmth into his arms. Martha kept her back turned. The sound of the man's movements was slow and tender, as if each motion was a prayer he didn't believe would be answered. She brought down a wool blanket from the shelf and placed it on the floor near the hearth. Not a gesture of kindness, just a practical decision, better than cold wood. No thanks came, none was expected. The boy whimpered once more, then fell quiet. As night thickened around the cabin, so too did the unspoken understanding between them. Martha made a small pot of broth and set it near the fire. She didn't serve it. She didn't say, "Eat." But when Jacob lifted the boy to sip from the tin cup, Martha saw how his fingers cradled the child's face. Gentle, familiar, terrified. She stared into the flames, letting them blur her vision, letting their warmth try to burn away the memory of another child, a girl with fevered eyes and lips gone blue. The storm rattled the window panes, the roof groaned, but inside the fire climbed higher. That night, Martha did not sleep in her bed. She lay in her rocking chair, her shawl pulled tight, her eyes on the hearth, and the bundle curled close to it. She didn't move. She didn't close her eyes. She just listened to the wind, to the soft breath of a child, and to the sound of her own heart remembering what it was to beat for someone other than herself. Morning came slowly, like someone testing the air before entering. Pale light dripped in through the frosted windows, reluctant and cold. Martha stirred beneath her quilt, though she hadn't slept much. The quiet crackle of the fire told her it hadn't died overnight. That was strange. She was always the one to wake first to feed the flames to keep the cabin breathing. When she pushed the quilt aside and stepped into the main room, she paused. Jacob sat on the floor near the hearth. Henry in his lap, swaddled in dry wool. The boy's lips had regained a touch of color. His little body was curled tight against his father's chest, breath shallow but steady. Jacob's eyes were closed, his arms cradling the child in a posture that suggested he hadn't moved all night. Martha said nothing. She crossed to the woodpile and added a log to the fire, her movements deliberate, efficient. The warmth danced across the boy's sleeping face. Something loosened in her chest, but she didn't acknowledge it. She moved to the cupboard and fetched the enamel pot, filled it with water drawn from the barrel near the door, and placed it on the stove to heat. Steam soon rose into the air, curling like breath into the rafters. Next came the flour, the salt, and the small paper pouch of yeast she'd been rationing since October. She would have saved it longer, but something in the boy's labored breathing told her he needed more than heat. He needed nourishment. She kneaded the dough like she always had, press, fold, turn until it felt alive under her hands. Her palms, worn and rough from years of firewood and fence repair, moved with the kind of memory that grief couldn't take. When the water bubbled, she poured it into a tin cup and set it beside a wooden plate, where she'd laid a thick slice of last night's bread. She didn't speak, didn't gesture, just left it on the table and returned to the dough. Jacob must have noticed the offering. He moved slowly, trying not to wake Henry, and laid the boy back on the blanket near the fire. Then he rose and stepped to the table, shoulders bowed. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice dry but genuine. Martha didn't reply. She didn't need to. He sipped the tea and tore off a bite of bread, eyes flicking between the food and the boy. Every movement he made was careful, precise, practiced, like someone who'd had to get it right too many times before. His hands trembled as he redressed Henry in a fresh undershirt from his pack woolen but thinned at the elbows and wrapped the scarf tighter around the boy's neck. Martha watched from across the room, arms folded. She studied the way Jacob handled the child, how his hands hovered just a second longer over Henry's chest, listening for breath. There was no fuss, no panic, just care. That did something to her, not admiration exactly, recognition. She moved forward and laid a blanket closer to the fire. "It'll hold heat longer down there," she muttered, not quite looking at him. Jacob met her eyes. "Appreciate it," he said, then knelt and lowered Henry gently onto the new spot. The boy sighed the kind of sound that reminded Martha of her daughter in those rare nights before the fever, when the cabin still echoed with bedtime songs and childish laughter. Henry's blue eyes fluttered open, then drifted shut again, the safety of warmth lulling him back into sleep. Martha sat near the hearth, her hands folded in her lap, watching his chest rise and fall. After a long silence, she asked, "What's his name?" Jacob blinked, surprised she'd spoken. "Henry," he said, smiling faintly. "Named him after my grandfather." She nodded, then, almost as an afterthought, added, "Looks like his mother." He swallowed. "Yes, she called him Will at first, but after she passed, I wanted something new, something clean." Martha heard the weight in that choice. Grief had a way of changing names just as it changed people. No more words passed between them. The fire cracked, the bread rose, the boy slept. Later, as Martha adjusted the oven's coals, and Jacob rinsed the tin mug in a basin of warm water, a quiet rhythm settled over the room. Not comfort, not yet, but routine. That Martha could handle. She stirred the dough again, shaping it into small loaves. One for the table, one for the shelf, one maybe for a journey if they were leaving soon. Then she caught Jacob's voice low and uncertain. "I didn't think past tonight," he admitted. Martha didn't answer. "I wrapped him in her scarf," he continued, barely above a whisper. "Thought maybe it'd keep her close." She glanced at the scarf, soft blue with frayed edges and faint-stitched stars. He traced one of them with his thumb eyes far away. "She made that before the trip," he added. "Said he should sleep under the stars even if we didn't have a roof." Martha's throat tightened. She turned away and busied herself with a pan of stew, though her hands were still. "Stay today," she said at last, not looking at him. "I'll make something proper for supper." It wasn't an offer, it was an instruction, tempered with caution, but not rejection. Jacob nodded once and bent to feed the fire again. The boy stirred at the warmth. Outside, the wind still rattled the roof, but inside, for the first time in years, the scent of rising yeast filled the cabin. And in that quiet, between bread and fire, something took root. By late afternoon, the snow had piled high enough against the window panes to dim the light in the room, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Martha sat in her chair near the hearth, the steam from her tea curling up beside her like a cat too cautious to settle. She knitted without looking, her fingers moving out of habit more than purpose. She was halfway through a scarf she'd started 2 winters ago. It had no intended recipient then, just something to keep her hands busy when her thoughts grew too loud. Across the room, Jacob rocked Henry slowly in his arms. The boy had begun to fuss again. His tiny limbs jerked in restless sleep, and his forehead was flushed with a rising fever. Jacob shifted his weight back and forth, humming tunelessly, his voice almost lost under the pop of the firewood. His hands, steady as they had been now, trembled slightly as he pressed a damp cloth to the boy's cheek. "He gets like this. When the wind's sharp," he murmured, not really speaking to her, not even to himself, just saying it aloud because saying nothing felt heavier. His mama did too. Martha stood without a word and crossed to them. She didn't ask permission. She reached out her arms, and after a moment's hesitation, Jacob handed the boy to her. Henry's small frame burned through the layers of fabric like an ember. His breath came shallow and quick. Martha cradled him against her chest, her cheek brushing his damp curls. Her eyes closed, and then, as if something ancient had stirred inside her, she began to hum. It wasn't a song meant for anyone's ears. It was something her mother had sung, barely a lullaby, more like breath shaped into melody. The words came after quiet and uneven. "Hush now, little sparrow, the wind won't find you here. Mama's arms are wide and warm. Sleep now, my dear." Her voice cracked halfway through the verse, but she kept going. Jacob didn't speak. He watched his lips parted slightly, astonished not just by the song, but by the sight of Martha holding his son like he was her own, as if this was what she'd been waiting for without knowing it. The boy whimpered, then relaxed his tiny fingers curling against the wool of her shawl. Martha shifted, easing him down onto a folded blanket close to the fire. She smoothed the hair from his brow and tucked the scarf closer to his throat. The stars stitched into it caught the firelight soft and silver. "He's burning up," she said softly, brushing his cheek again. Jacob knelt beside her. "He always gets worse when the weather turns. I carried dried willow bark, but I ran out 2 nights ago." She nodded and stood. "I have feverfew and peppermint. They won't fix him, but they might give his body room to fight." She moved quickly, but with that same quiet steadiness, setting a kettle on the stove, crushing herbs with the back of a spoon, measuring things by feel instead of weight. While she worked, Jacob took her place beside the child. His hand never left Henry's chest, as if by touch alone he could anchor the boy to the earth. Once the tea was steeped, Martha handed it to him without comment. He coaxed a few spoonfuls into Henry's mouth, murmuring soft encouragement. The boy stirred, eyelids fluttering but not opening. Martha watched them from the shadows, something in her expression carved from grief and memory. Then, her voice low, she said, "My daughter used to get fevers like that. She'd fight sleep until the very end." Jacob looked up. "She's gone. Years now," Martha replied. "Took her in less than 2 days. I couldn't do a thing but hold her." There was a silence between them that wasn't empty. It was full of shared wounds of things too hard to explain. Jacob nodded, eyes damp. "We lost her mother last spring. Gave birth on the road west. I buried her by a creek outside Cheyenne." Martha didn't flinch, but her hands clenched the hem of her apron. She wanted Henry to grow up under open sky, Jacob said, his voice tight. Said we'd start again in Montana. She packed the scarf for him. Said even if we had no roof, he'd always have the stars. Martha turned toward the fire. "She sounds like she had her heart in the right place." "She did," he said, "but dreams don't keep out the cold." "No," Martha whispered. "They don't." Later that evening, Henry's fever broke just enough that his breathing slowed. He shifted in his sleep and curled against the warmth of the fire. Martha laid a hand on his back and exhaled deeply. Jacob stood a few feet away watching her. "You didn't have to take us in," he said. She didn't look up. "You knocked." He waited, then, "But most folks would have turned us away." Martha finally met his eyes. "Most folks don't know what it's like to carry a child through a storm." She rose and returned to her chair. Jacob stayed where he was, the firelight casting long lines across his face. Outside, the wind howled through the trees like a memory too loud to forget. Inside, the cabin had grown warmer, not from the fire alone, but from something deeper, an ember catching at the edge of sorrow. That night, Martha didn't sleep in her bed. She lay on the floor near Henry's makeshift cot, her back to the wall, her eyes open. The boy murmured once in his sleep, just a word. She stiffened. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Mama." She sat up straight, breath caught in her throat. She pressed her hands to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes for the first time in years. She didn't cry when her husband's body was brought home wrapped in a cavalry flag. She didn't cry when her daughter died in her arms. But that word, spoken in a fever dream by a child who wasn't hers, nearly undid her. She rose and stepped outside into the wind, letting the cold bite into her skin. Behind her, the fire kept glowing, and inside, so did something else. The next day dawned colder than the last. The sun, thin and pale, barely crept above the horizon before retreating again behind heavy clouds. Martha moved like she always did, quiet, efficient, but the air around her felt heavier, as if the night had left something behind. She didn't speak of the word Henry had whispered in his sleep, and Jacob didn't ask why she looked red-eyed when she emerged from the snow-swept porch that morning. The boy stirred fitfully, his fever low but lingering. Jacob kept a cool cloth pressed to his forehead, murmuring soft, useless comforts. Martha brought broth and fresh linens, neither of them discussing what came next, until midday when someone knocked, not with desperation this time, but with intent. 2 sharp raps. Jacob froze, hand tightening around the spoon he'd been using to stir stew. Martha set down her knife and grabbed the lantern. Her other hand drifted lower beneath the folds of her apron, where an old Colt .45 remained tucked against her thigh. She had not fired it in years, but the weight of it was familiar, reassuring, in a way human presence had not been for some time. Jacob approached the door beside her. She met his eyes, and for the first time there was no wall between them, only readiness. She cracked the door slightly and held the lantern high. 2 figures stood in the blowing snow, ragged men wrapped in mismatched coats, their faces streaked with grime. One was older, his beard matted his expression flat and unreadable. The other was younger, thinner, shivering, his eyes darting between them and the edges of the tree line as though expecting company. "Just need water," the older man rasped. "Cold enough to kill a man out here." His words were plain, but Martha knew desperation when she saw it. These weren't simple travelers. They were scavengers' men, made lean and dangerous by too many hungry nights and too few choices. She didn't lower the lantern. "Not tonight," she said, her voice steady and low. Jacob stepped forward, positioning himself in the narrow opening between door and wind. "We've got a sick child." He added, his voice calm but unyielding. "Please move along." The younger man's eyes narrowed. "Ain't asking for bread, just water." "You'll find a stream half a mile west," Martha said. "Keep moving before the dark sets in." A moment stretched cold, taut. The kind of silence that measured intent. But then the older one gave a slow nod. Didn't come for trouble. They turned, boots crunching through the drift as they disappeared into the blur of falling snow. Martha shut the door and locked it tight. Jacob leaned his forehead against the wood. That was close. She nodded, then turned to check on Henry, who was still curled on the rug near the hearth, cheeks flushed but breath steady. "You should go," she said quietly, not meeting Jacob's eyes. "It's safer for him. Raiders are bad enough. You two'll draw more." Jacob stiffened. "He's not strong enough to travel. We need one more night." She didn't answer right away. The fear in her chest was sharp, not fear of the men, but of what she'd started to feel. Fear of letting down the guard that grief had built like stone. That evening they ate in silence. Thin broth, mashed potatoes, and the last slice of cornbread from the winter stores. Jacob fed Henry slowly, spoon by spoon, while Martha watched the fire and pretended not to notice the way her hands shook. As night pressed against the walls, the wind picked up. It scratched at the eaves like fingers desperate to get in. Martha lit every oil lamp in the cabin one by one, the light pooling in warm circles around the floor. Shadows retreated, but her unease remained. She kept the revolver close. When the fire burned low, she added another log, then sat in her chair beside the hearth. Across the room, Jacob rocked Henry gently, his humming quiet, a thread of melody running through the stillness. For a time, it was almost peaceful, until another knock came. This one was softer, deliberate, as if whoever stood outside knew how thin the line was between fear and violence. Martha's blood turned cold. She rose slowly, lifting the lantern again. Jacob passed Henry to the cot and stood beside her. Her hand rested on the revolver grip finger near the trigger. They opened the door just enough to see two new faces, men they didn't recognize. Dirt-covered eyes, wary and sunken thin from hunger but alert. "We saw smoke," one of them said. "A warm place is worth dying for these days." "Not here," Martha replied, her tone like iron. Jacob added, "We have nothing left to spare." There was a pause. The taller one looked past them into the warm glow of the cabin, into the flicker of firelight and the small shape of a sleeping child. "I see," he said. But his partner didn't move. Jacob stepped forward. "Go," he said, voice like a hammer on steel. Finally, the second man turned away muttering. They vanished into the storm without another word. Martha shut the door and bolted it. She leaned against it for a moment, eyes closed. Then she whispered almost to herself, "I used to think I was safest alone." Jacob turned to her. "And now?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers tightened around the revolver, then slowly loosened. "Maybe I was just waiting for the wrong kind of danger." He stepped closer. She didn't pull away. For the first time in years, she leaned into someone. His arm wrapped around her shoulder, and they stood there together, not as strangers but as something new. Something still unnamed. Outside, the wind thrashed against the walls, but inside, where fire warmed the corners of the room, and the boy slept beneath stitched stars, Martha let her tears come freely. Not because she was afraid, but because for the first time in so long she wasn't. By morning, the storm had softened. Snow still clung to the eaves and blanketed the earth like a shroud, but the wind had calmed. The sky above was a chalky white, and the world beyond the cabin was muffled, blurred. Martha stood at the stove, pouring water into the dented kettle, listening to the quiet hum of life behind her. Henry, now sitting up with a bit of color in his cheeks, clutched a wooden spoon, with both hands drumming softly against a tin plate. Jacob sat beside him, helping him balance. The boy's fever had broken fully overnight, and though his voice was still hoarse and his limbs slow, he smiled when Martha turned to look at him. Then came the sound of hooves. Not a rider lost in the woods. Not strangers seeking shelter. This was slower, purposeful, the approach of someone with reason to visit. Martha wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside before Jacob could follow. The air bit at her face, but she welcomed it. It steadied her. A man dismounted. His horse was dusted and white and mud-spattered to the knees. He carried no rifle, but wore a black coat and scarf, a somber presence against the washed-out landscape. "Reverend Alden," she said, her voice unreadable. "Martha." He nodded, tucking his gloves into his belt. His eyes moved past her toward the faint glow in the windows. "There've been questions in town." "Then speak them plain," she said flatly. The Reverend hesitated. "You've been seen smoke every day, boot tracks in and out. Someone said they saw a man hauling firewood out back. Folks are wondering if you're hosting company." "Mail company." "Proper died with my husband," Martha replied, not flinching, "along with half the valley." Reverend Alden's lips pressed thin. "And the child." Before she could answer, a small voice broke the air. "Mama." The word came as bright and true as a sunrise. Henry, wrapped in a wool blanket and covered in flour smudges, had stepped into the doorway, eyes shining. Behind him, Jacob appeared in the shadows, frozen. Martha knelt slowly and ran a hand through Henry's hair, her expression calm. Her eyes never left the Reverend. "If you came to judge, judge me for surviving. But don't question what this house needs now." Alden's brow furrowed. The boy's innocence hung in the air like a verdict. "I will pray for you," he said at last. "Then pray to understand the shape of grace," Martha answered. He left without further word. The hooves faded into the silence of the woods. Inside, Jacob stood near the hearth, his face unreadable. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, then finally whispered, "I didn't teach him to call you that." Martha turned toward the basin and poured warm water into it. "I know," she said, her voice soft. Henry climbed onto the bench beside her, giggling as he dipped his fingers into the flour. She didn't stop him. Instead, she handed him a second lump of dough and a tiny spoon. Jacob watched her, watched them. He didn't speak again. He didn't have to. The air between them had shifted, no longer the space of strangers, but the stillness of something sacred, something found. Later, when Henry napped near the fire with dough on his cheek and a blanket tucked around his legs, Martha returned from the root cellar to find Jacob holding a folded cloth in his hands. He wasn't moving, just standing near the hearth, tracing the edges of the fabric with his thumbs. "She made this," he said quietly, "for him. Said it would remind him of the sky, of stars." It was the same scarf, the one Martha had tucked around Henry so many nights now. Jacob stepped forward and hung it on the nail above the kettle hook. "She would have wanted him to have a real home," he added, not looking at her. Martha stared at the scarf, her chest aching with something she didn't have a name for. Then, without a word, she moved to the table and poured 3 cups of tea, one for Jacob, one for herself, and one in the little carved mug he'd whittled for Henry. They sat at the table together for the first time. No one said the word family. But when Henry awoke and laughed at the steam rising from his mug, Martha smiled. Not wide, not freely, but real. And that was enough. Later, she walked to the doorway and looked down. 3 pairs of shoes rested neatly on the stoop, one small one, large one old, and worn from too many winters spent alone. She didn't move them. She didn't need to, because they belonged there. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, like a breath on the back of the neck. The icicles on the eaves dripped slowly, steadily, leaving trails down the sides of the cabin. The snow receded in patches, revealing the frostbitten earth beneath. And inside, life unfolded, not with grand gestures, but in soft, daily rituals. Martha stood at the counter, kneading dough, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. The kitchen smelled of yeast and cedar smoke. Henry sat on a stool beside her, flour dusting his cheeks, giggling every time his fingers squished the dough wrong. Jacob leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the scene with a half smile. They had said nothing about staying. No declarations, no promises. But Jacob hadn't repacked his satchel in over a week. Still, that morning something was different. He folded the old wool blanket, his wife's the one sewn with a patch of stars, and placed it carefully into the satchel he'd laid open on the table. He didn't move fast. His hands lingered on each item longer than necessary. It was the kind of slow movement a man makes when he's trying to leave without really leaving. Martha saw it. She didn't speak. Instead, she pulled a linen-wrapped bundle from the drawer beside the stove. She crossed the room and placed it in Jacob's hands. When he unwrapped it, the familiar scarf fell open. The threads were more frayed now, but still soft, still full of stories. "Don't let him forget where he found warmth," she said simply. Jacob swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. "I didn't think I'd stay this long. I didn't think I'd want anyone to," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. That night, the satchel remained by the door, but untouched. In the morning, Martha took a small wooden peg and hammered it into the wall beside the hearth. Then she added 2 smaller ones. She didn't announce it. She just hung 3 scarves on them, hers Jacob's and Henry's tiny blue one. Later that day, 3 toothbrushes wrapped in twine appeared on the wash basin shelf. Henry's was carved from a branch, the bristles uneven but functional. He was proud of it, even if he kept forgetting which end to use. Outside, the earth softened. Mud pooled around the base of the cabin. Chickadees returned to the pine branches. The air no longer smelled of wood smoke alone, but of pine sap damp soil and the first green things daring to push through. Inside, the rhythm held. Martha rose before dawn and stirred the fire. Jacob split wood before breakfast and patched the gap in the roof that had leaked for 3 years. Henry scattered cornmeal on the floor and tried to sweep it up with a horsehair brush. He never finished the job, but Martha never minded. One afternoon, while Martha sorted herbs in the root cellar, Henry toddled in carrying something in both hands, a small wooden comb, old and worn smooth. Her heart stopped. She hadn't seen that comb since the day her daughter died. She'd hidden it away deep in the back of the drawer, wrapped in a bit of muslin. Henry held it to his cheek and smiled. Then, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, he reached up and gently touched it to Martha's face. She froze. The air felt too thin to breathe. For a moment, she didn't feel like the woman who had buried a child and locked the world out. She felt like someone remembered. She let him keep the comb. That evening, Jacob came in from the woods, his boots muddy and shoulders damp from the melted snow. He leaned his axe against the porch railing and stepped inside, shaking out his coat. Martha handed him a mug of hot cider without a word. Their hands brushed as he took it. Neither pulled away. They stood side by side as Henry giggled on the floor, stacking blocks made from old firewood scraps. Still, no one asked what they were now. No one said family. But it didn't have to be spoken. It was in the way Martha pulled the extra quilt over Jacob's shoulders when he dozed near the fire. In the way Jacob plucked burrs from her apron after she'd tended the chickens. In the way Henry reached for both their hands when he woke from a nap, needing not just one, but 2 people to anchor him. And one day, Martha looked down and saw his hand wrapped around hers, his eyes full of trust, and she didn't flinch. That night, she set out 3 bowls for supper. She didn't hesitate. Jacob added a sprig of dried thyme to the stew, and Henry, watching closely, did the same with his tiny fingers. They ate in silence but not emptiness. At dusk, the sun cast gold light through the cabin window. Martha walked to the door and stood in the frame. 3 pairs of shoes were lined up neatly outside. One small, one large, one with a cracked sole and threadbare leather hers. She didn't move them. She just stood there, listening to the faint laughter behind her. The door swung gently in the breeze like it had learned how to stay open without being vulnerable. Because something had changed. The cabin, once a monument to grief, now breathed with warmth. Not from the stove alone, but from the shared rhythm of 3 people who had no map for what they were building, only the need for shelter, the ache for connection, and the courage to remain. They hadn't chosen each other the way stories often begin, but they had stayed. And in staying, they'd made something stronger than kinship. They'd made home. Some people believe love must arrive loudly, ringing with vows or painted with fireworks. But sometimes love returns in quieter ways. In shared bread, in a child's laugh, in the way someone leans their shoulder near yours without asking. Martha Green didn't plan for family to find her again, and Jacob never thought he'd trust a stranger with the most precious thing he had left. But hearts, even broken ones, remember the warmth of another heartbeat beside them. If you've ever lost someone and thought the door to love had closed for good, this story is for you. If it touched something in you, don't let it end here. Comment below, share your own story, or simply tell us if you've found your way home again. And if you haven't, hold on. Sometimes all it takes is one knock on the door. Whispers of the Wild West where heart meets horizon, and every tale reminds us that even in the coldest winters, warmth can find its way back.